A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertrauten Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Kevin.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geber.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geber with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And this episode has been generously sponsored by 20-Minute Daf. 20-Minute Daf is a clear, concise shiur given by Rav Shaul Greenwald with a clarity perfect for people who are short on time or looking for a quick review of the day's daf. The shiur, it's called the 20-Minute Daf, and unlike me, he actually sticks to that. It never gets past 22, 23, tops 25 minutes. And, I can personally vouch for it. I'm a Daf Yomi participant, and it's very enjoyable. He's clear. I find it very useful. Daf Yomi this coming week is starting Psachim, so it's a new Masechta for all of those who gave up during Reuven and fell out of the cycle and want to get back into it. So Psachim is the perfect opportunity. So you can join 20-Minute Daf by subscribing on all podcast platforms or join the WhatsApp group at 20minutedaf.com. So I highly recommend that you join me and many other users in this fantastic shiur. Tonight's is the yahrzeit of Rav Aharon Kotler, the great, legendary Torah leader, Kletzk Rosh Yeshiva, the Lakewood Rosh Yeshiva, an incredible person, so much to talk about. And since it's his yahrzeit, we'll have a short mini-series, probably, besides for tonight, we'll try to have another one or two. We'll see how it goes. Speak a little bit tonight about Rav Aharon Kotler's early years, and we'll try to get to other aspects of his life and leadership in other episodes. Last year, we did have another one on his activism. Perhaps I'll have what to say about that as well. I just want to, before I get to Rav Aharon Kotler, I want to just read the episode I just had on Rav Gustman, Rabbi Yisrael Gustman, just the other day, generated an enormous response. I just want to choose a few. There's apparently I guess it was an omission on my part. Everyone was complaining that I did not mention the story of Rav Gustman watering the plants. And some said, if you didn't say it, then it must not be true. That's not why I didn't say it. So first of all, what's the story? The story was that when Rav Gustman was hiding in the forest during the war, he sustained himself simply, by like most anyone who survived during the war in the forest, by eating plant life, different grasses and plants. And he had even been advised by Reb Chaim Moshe Grozovsky before the war about which plants are edible, which are poisonous, and he used that knowledge to save himself and his family during the war, that sometimes he didn't have anything else to eat except for simple plants in the forest. And as a gratitude to the plant life which had sustained him, so he used to water personally. He had a garden, and in fact the Chavatzelet house where he bought in Rechavia, the yeshiva, he bought that house. It also had a garden in the courtyard, and he wanted it to have a garden. and so he should have plants there, and he himself would personally water it as hakaras hatov, as gratitude. So it's a true story. It's definitely a true story. As far as I know, all the sources bring it. The reason I did not say it because I assumed that it was so famous and so well known that you don't need me to relate it. But everyone complained and kvetched. And like I said, some even suspected that perhaps the omission is saying it's not true. So I just wanted to clarify that it's definitely a true story, and it's an amazing story. One listener even wanted to compare Rav Gustman to Moshe Rabbeinu. He said Moshe Rabbeinu had gratitude to the sand, didn't want to hit the sand because it helped him hide the Egyptian who he had personally killed. And Rav Gustman, he had gratitude to the plants when he was hiding in the forest and he was killing German Nazis as a partisan. So it was a comparison of Rav Gustman to Moshe Rabbeinu. Interesting comparison. Either way, so we'll go on to another couple of letters here. One other letter writer responded. Actually, he wasn't even a letter writer. He was so upset about it, he had to give me a phone call. He said, "How did you not cry when relating the stories about Rav Gustman during the war and losing his child?" He said, how could a person not cry? So I have to admit that I guess I'm a bit heartless. I didn't cry, or I was just totally engaged in relating the story. But it's a good question. When we hear such stories, we have to cry. Another letter writer submitted an interesting story. I quote, "He was learning in the same Beis Medrash as Rav Gustman, and he had a question on the sugya. He went to ask Rav Gustman. The latter was deep in his writings, so he gave my Rebbe a quick answer. A few minutes later, my Rebbe had another question. When he went over to ask, Rav Gustman told him, 'Junger Mann, ich bin schicker jetzt mit mein eigene Bronfen.' I'm currently drunk with my own whiskey." In other words, he was involved. He didn't want to be disturbed. He was involved, completely absorbed with his own writings, and he's coming to Hakachainik with his questions. And Rav Gustman, it's a funny story. Either way, then this is another clarification that's needed, important clarification. Someone asked me the following question today. What does it mean that the Chabina Rav passed away? What does it mean that the Chabina Rav suggested to Rav Gustman to buy a building in Rechavia if the Chabina Rav passed away a good few years before Rav Gustman came to Eretz Yisrael? That is an excellent question, and I meant to say this. I thought I even had it in my notes. I guess I inadvertently omitted it. But Rav Gustman came on a pilot trip in 1964 to Israel to seek options of transferring the yeshiva there. And that's when he consulted with Chabina Rav, who passed away in 1965. Rav Gustman himself was only able to move and transfer the yeshiva several years later in 1971. So that's how it works out. So we move over to today's yard site, Rav Aharon Kotler, and we're going to focus on his early years today, talk about a little bit about the title of this episode is The Origins of Greatness, because, he's destined for greatness from birth, and I can't have any other thought otherwise, because I don't want to be banned. So Rav Aharon Kotler, I had an episode about him last year, also on the art site, about his activism. And talked about the different, he was a mentor to many activists in the United States, the communal activists, Askonim, Irving Bunim, and later his son Amos Bunim, Rav Moshe Scherer of the Agudas Yisrael, Marvin Schick, who just passed away recently, the famous philanthropist Zev Wolfson, Stephen Klein, Ernst Bodenheimer. I even once spoke to Marvin Heyer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He told me that he used to drive Rav Aharon Kotler to RJJ once or twice a year. Rav Aharon would give a shiur there, and Marvin Heyer was his driver, so he told me that he was influenced by him. There's many, many more. So it's interesting that some of these activists went to, after Rav Aharon Kotler's passing, they went to Moshe Feinstein and asked him to be their guide. I'm not sure which ones from that list it was. Maybe it was only one or two. I don't know. some of them, or one of them, and they asked him to be their guide. And Rav Moshe said to them, "I'm happy to answer your questions, and if you have anything that you want to seek advice, you're more than welcome. My door is open. But if you're expecting me to be like Rav Aharon Kotler was to you, then you got the wrong address." Rav Aharon was unique. Rav Aharon, he wasn't someone that the activists would come and ask advice from. Rav Aharon was one who initiated the activism, who spearheaded the projects, and who goaded others into activity as well, who pushed them, who called them up, who didn't let them sleep, who mentored them in communal responsibility and activism. He was the one who was out there and the go-getter. It's unbelievable, and actually is amazing that he was unique in that style. But like I said, with this, that was last year's topic, and we'll go to his early years. So it's interesting. My wife's grandfather had learned in the Rav Aharon Yeshiva in Europe before the war. It wasn't in Kletzk. It was already when the war began, and the yeshiva was in Slutzk, and had fled from Soviet-controlled Poland to Eastern Poland in the beginning of the war, and to Lithuania, like many of the other yeshivas. It was in Slutzk. So he studied by Rav Aharon for about a year during that time. So when he passed away, my wife's grandfather passed away, so I arranged, he was in the Mir in Shanghai, so I arranged for his levaya to be in front of the Mir Yeshiva. And the signs stated that he was in the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai, and he was also a Talmud of Rav Aharon Kotler from before the war. So I noticed, an acquaintance by the funeral, and I asked him, "Did you know my wife's grandfather? What are you doing here?" He says, "No, but I saw on the sign that he was a Talmud of Rav Aharon Kotler." So I said, "You saw on the sign he was also in the Mir in Shanghai. That's also a good reason to show up, no?" So he said, "Nah, I wouldn't have come just for that, but he was a Talmud of Rav Aharon." So I was like, wow, I got to come to this levaya. And then he says to me, "So he was your wife's grandfather, so was he a Rosh Yeshiva? He was a Talmud of Rav Aharon." So I said, "No, he owned a store on the Lower East Side." So, he was, quite surprised. And it's an image that of the legacy of Rav Aharon Kotler that is in the mind of many. The influence that he has, the impact that someone who's a Talmud of Rav Aharon, that's the ultimate title of respect, and the automatic assumption is that he was a Rosh Yeshiva. So that says a lot about Rav Aharon and his leadership, and therefore it behooves us to examine his life and his history and his place in history. Which brings me to the next point, is that what's fascinating is that someone with such an influence and such a builder does not have a proper comprehensive biography. There's the Aaron Sorosky biography in Hebrew. Alter Pecker, another student of Rav Aharon from Kletzk, he wrote a rather concise, but it's pretty well done, but not a really full biography. But that's another one. Then there's another one that's not really about Rav Aharon Kotler, but it's more about the legacy of Rav Aharon Kotler, or the alleged legacy of Rav Aharon Kotler. And there's others there's different profiles on him that have been written more recently, but they're essays or articles or profiles, not really, shockingly, there's not a full comprehensive, not even an art scroll biography. And it's truly surprising and really needed. Speaking of legacies of Rav Aharon Kotler, one of the lesser known ones is that there's an entire neighborhood in Bnei Brak called Ramat Aharon, named after Rav Aharon Kotler. That's just, another tidbit. So Rav Aharon is born into a very prestigious rabbinic family, orphaned at a young age. His father was Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. Rav Aharon Kotler wasn't Kotler. His name was Rav Aharon Meltzer until much later on. He in order to avoid the czarist draft, he changed his name, which was quite common in Russia for Jews to do in Russia. So he came from this very well-known rabbinic family, the Pinus family, who had been rabbis in Minsk, Two of his ancestors were rabbis in Minsk. Another one of his ancestors was a rabbi in Slutzk. And ironically, Rav Aharon would go on to study in yeshivas in Minsk, and he would become a Rebbi in Slutzk. So he had ancestral connections in both places. His mother passed away when he was 3 years old. His father passed away when he was 11. So when he's a child, he's already an orphan. He eventually lived by his uncle, a Dayan in Minsk, Rebbetzin Chana Perl. But his older siblings had pretty much all strayed away from traditional Judaism, from Yiddishkeit at that point. So to save him, he was sent to Krinik, to the yeshiva of Rav Zalman Sender Kahana Shapiro. After Rav Zalman Sender left the yeshiva in Malch, and Rav Shimon took over that yeshiva in Malch. So Rav Zalman Sender opened the yeshiva in Krinik, and that's where Rav Aharon Kotler first studied. Rav Aharon's father, Rav Shneur Zalman Pinus, was the Rav in Svislach in Russian. In Yiddish, the Jews called it Sislevich. And he himself, Rav Shneur Zalman, had studied at the Volozhin Yeshiva. So it was came from a very, very prestigious family. And from Krinik, Rav Aharon went on to Minsk, where he studied at the Grozovsky shul. And that's how he got to become friends with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he got to know Reuven Grozovsky there as well. But he went back and forth to Minsk a couple of times. He went from Minsk to study in Slabodka, in the other yeshiva in Slabodka, to the Knesset Beis Yitzchak yeshiva in Slabodka, of where Rav Baruch Ber Leibowitz was the yeshiva. He was there for half a year. Then went back to Minsk, and then he went back to Slabodka, this time to the Knesset Yisrael yeshiva of the Musar yeshiva of the Alter of Slabodka. There are two parallel yeshivas in Slabodka at the time, which I referenced in several other episodes about Slabodka, about the Alter, about all kinds of related topics. So, like I said, he was in the Grozovsky, which is like the butcher's shul. It was a kibbutz yeshiva, and he befriended Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who's by that time, and even though Rabbi Yaakov grew up in Dolhinov, a small village, but at that time his parents had already moved to Minsk. So Rav Aharon, who was an orphan, he would go over to Rabbi Yaakov's house for meals, and sometimes they would play chess together. Rav Aharon was a very intensive chess player who took the games very seriously. Intense in everything that he ever did. So it came, as part of his life. It was at this time during his youth that Rav Aharon enjoyed, like many other youth at the time, and like I said, all his siblings had already completely strayed from Yiddishkeit. And, many, especially in a city like Minsk, this was quite common among the Jewish youth. Rav Aharon enjoyed reading Russian literature, and especially Alexander Pushkin, the famous Russian author, who happens to be all Jews liked him. It was almost said in Russia that a Jewish home had to have Pushkin. And interestingly, in the context of Jewish history soundbites, Rav Aharon had a love and a great knowledge of Jewish history. And sometimes in his later years, when he would speak to donors or to speak to Balabatim in general, he would spew forth with a tremendous knowledge of Jewish history and the importance of knowing it. Very interesting that he had that side to him as well. So he comes to Slabodka. I remember hearing once when I was in the Mir Yeshiva, so the Yeshiva of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, he quoted his namesake, his great-grandfather namesake, the Alter of Slabodka, as saying that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz had a yeshiva. He had 400 students in his yeshiva, and Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz would say that of those 400, there are 40 who are extra special, unique, and the whole 400 is worth it for the 40 who are the mitzuyanim, who are the top. And the Alter Slabodka would quote that and say, in my yeshiva in Slabodka, I also have, I don't know if he had 400, he had quite a few, 200-300, and there's 40 that are mitzuyanim, that they're the top and the best. And he said, but there's one mitzuyan sheba mitzuyanim, there's one who stands head and shoulders above everyone else, and that's Rav Aharon Kotler, or as he was known then as Arlis Slevitzer. And there was the top students of the Slabodka Yeshiva, the top in learning, and there was also the top students of the Slabodka Yeshiva who were the close students of the Alter and Musar. and it's really two different lists. Some people were on both, people like Rav Aharon Kotler and Rav Kamenetsky. Some were more known as the Musar Talmidim of the Alter, like Rav Meir Chodesh and Rav Grozovsky, a few others, and some were not so much Talmidim of the Alter of Slabodka, but they were, very, very, from the best in the learning, and they gained their reputation because Slabodka was the best of both. It was the best in Musar, the best in learning, and a very unique place. And Rav Aharon is there during the golden age of the Slabodka Yeshiva. He's there during the decade before World War I, when it reached its peak. And talking about Reuven Grozovsky was there, Chatzkel Sarna was there, Rabbi Kamenetsky, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg had just left right before that. He was there. There was, right before World War I, Reuven came, and Rav Meir Chodesh, and it was just a place where Rav Grozovsky, of course, was there. The people who were to play such a future role in the Torah world were all there in Slabodka during its golden age and during the time that Rav Aharon was there. When Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Aharon both arrived together by train from Minsk to get their entrance exam into Slabodka, so Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, the Rosh Yeshiva, he asked them to give their entrance exam was to refute a piece of K'tzais HaChoshen, which was a yeshiva classic commentary, and their reactions were very telling of who they were. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was shocked, he was horrified. He said that in Minsk, in the yeshivas in Minsk, in Blumka's Klois, and in the other Shlomo Goloventz's yeshiva, all the yeshivas that he had attended in Minsk, they were taught that the K'tzais HaChoshen is holy. What he says is gospel. How can we refute or argue on the K'tzais HaChoshen? Rav Aharon, with his incisive and brilliant mind and his personality, he says to the Rosh Yeshiva Moshe Mordechai, okay, tell me which piece it is. Let's go ahead. I'll slug it up. I'll ask. I'll refute it. I'll argue on it. No problem. And that was by the Rosh Yeshiva. But when they went into the Alter played hard to get, which was a educational style that the Alter occasionally did with different students or potential students. So he said, I'm not sure if we have room. It might be too crowded. We might not be able to receive you. And so Rav Aharon, they came all the way from Minsk, he was disappointed. So he says, when they got back to their room, there was a senior student of Slabodka who was their roommate. So Rav Aharon says out loud, very loudly to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, he says, no problem, the Alter didn't accept us. We'll go to the other Slabodka Yeshiva, the non-Musar Slabodka Yeshiva of Rav Baruch Ber. And immediately the Alter called them back in and accepted them into the yeshiva. But Rav Aharon attended all of Rav Baruch Ber's shiurim, which was common for the yeshiva. The Knesset Yisrael students would go to the other yeshiva and to hear Rav Baruch Ber's famous shiurim. And Rav Aharon, one time they locked the door to not allow outsiders in, so Rav Aharon climbed in through a window. And Rav Aharon got close with everyone. He was close to the Baruch Ber. He was, of course, very close to the Alter. The Alter would actually have Rav Aharon give them the distinctive privilege of being his guest for Shabbos meals quite often, which most students at the yeshiva did not get. So he would very often be by the Alter for Shabbos. Rav Aharon was one of the only ones in the yeshiva who would argue and question during Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein's daily shir. Rav Aharon would which was accepted to interrupt if he had a good question. He was one of the ones who did it. He was definitely unique and brilliant among the Slabodka students at the time. And because Slabodka was a suburb of Kovna, so there was very often, which is a major city, so very often there was great rabbis who would be visiting, who would be on communal issues or passing through, and they would deliver a shir once they were in Kovna, and all the Slabodka students from both yeshivas would go ahead and be excited to participate in the shir of some of the great leading Torah scholars of its day. So one of them was the Telzer Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Blazer Gordon, and Rav Aharon asked and interrupted in his shir as well with a question. And Rav Blazer Gordon, who was a very fiery individual, he yelled at him, And as he did to Reb Shlomo Hyman, who was from the other Slabodka Yeshiva, and he also interrupted that same shir of Reb Lezer Gordon. And Rav Aharon would later in his life do the same thing to those who interrupted him in his shir. He would yell at them in the fiery way of the way Torah discourse is carried out. He would do that to his own Talmidim, so it was kind of scary interrupting him. Reb Chaim Brisker came and delivered a shir. Rav Aharon attended. Reb David Karliner, Reb David L. Friedman, the Rav in Karlin, was also one of the most respected Torah leaders of his time. And during this time, Reb Aharon was still in contact, or officially in contact with his family members and his siblings. Like I mentioned, especially his older sister Malka was trying to convince him to leave the yeshiva world. She was, a negative influence on his Torah studies and his future Torah career, and she felt that he had a lot of potential outside the yeshiva, so she would send him letters. And in fact, the Alter of Slabodka, who he was wanting to do this with, he's known to have done this with other students as well. He censored his mail. He blocked all the letters from Rav Aharon's sister to make sure that this adverse influence on the potential that he had of his future in Torah study would not cause him to leave the yeshiva if he would be in regular contact with this sister and her entreaties to get him to leave Slabodka. So at a relatively young age at the time, at the age of 22, Rav Aharon gets married. In those days in Slabodka, they're mid-20s, sometimes even late 20s, or even beyond. And here, surprisingly, Rav Aharon gets married quite young, and the reason was because Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, his prospective father-in-law, had heard about him. Rav Isser Zalman, of course, had previously been the Rosh Yeshiva in Slabodka and was sent by the Alter to open a quasi-Slabodka branch in Slutzk. And so Rav Isser Zalman had heard about him and wanted him for his daughter, Chana Perl, who eventually becomes the Rebbetzin Chana Perl, and that became an important addition to Rav Aharon's life, to his marriage to Rebbetzin Chana Perl, and to become the son-in-law of Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. And it's interesting. I heard once from Rav Aharon, one of Rav Aharon's grandchildren, who one of the Schwartzman grandchildren. So after Reb Dov Schwartzman divorced Rav Aharon's daughter, so the young grandchildren somewhat grew up in Rav Aharon's house. So they got this exposure to actually living and being brought up, raised. Amazing privilege to be raised by their grandfather Rav Aharon. So one of them related to me that he remembers his grandfather had to call someone for some reason, fundraising, or I don't know, whatever it was, some communal issue, and he was trying to remember the phone number, and he was struggling to remember it. And finally, he blurted it out, he remembered it, and he got excited that he remembered the phone number. And his Rebbetzin, who was in the room, Rebbetzin Chana Perl, she said, such a brilliant mind, and it's wasted on remembering phone numbers. That's what she criticized. I guess she was the only one in the world who could actually criticize Rav Aharon. And, I guess we all follow the advice of Rebbetzin Chana Perl today, because not a single person in the world today knows any phone numbers by heart. Even though, at least me, I'm not a brilliant mind wasting it on it, but, remembering phone numbers is a thing of the past. But either way, what's interesting about Rav Aharon is that he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva of Kletzk when he's 30 years old. He's appointed right when he's married, when they're still in Slutzk. Before World War I, he's appointed a Rebbi in Slutzk. Go through World War I, revolution, communist takeover, and eventually because of the Soviets, harassment, religious institutions. So Rav Aharon takes a faction of the yeshiva. Rav Isser Zalman stays in Slutzk for another few years with another faction of the yeshiva, where Rav Aharon crosses the border into Poland, into independent Poland, and they open a new yeshiva, which is essentially a branch or a continuation of the Slutzk Yeshiva in Kletzk. But Rav Isser Zalman stayed in the Soviet Union for the meantime. He came a couple of years later, rejoined. But this is Rav Aharon's yeshiva. And he becomes a Rosh Yeshiva of a major yeshiva in Poland when he's 30 years old. And when Rav Isser Zalman, a couple of years later, leaves for Eretz Yisrael, Rav Aharon is only 32, 33 years old, and he's a full-blown Rosh Yeshiva. And everything he did it when he was young. He became, very big very quickly when he was young. It's interesting, Rav Shach, who remembered Rav Aharon Kotler both in Slabodka when they studied at the same time. Also, Rav Shach was there in that golden age. And also, they were Rebbeim together in Kletzk. Rav Shach had married Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer's niece and was also hired as a Rebbi in the yeshiva. So he related that Rav Aharon was shy by nature. Incredibly enough, someone with Rav Aharon's personality. And he even said, Rav Shach said that he saw this with his own eyes, that if someone unfamiliar walked into his shiur in the middle, he would get all flustered and nervous because it was someone who he didn't know, and his shyness would kick in. So Rav Shach was pointing that out to say that he overcame his natural shyness to be that dynamic, charismatic leader that he was to become. And we'll continue with this in the next episode of part 2 about Rav Aharon, about his Kletzk years and his arrival in the United States. So this was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageberer.com for questions, comments, sources, sponsorships, tours, lectures, and everything else. Don't forget to check out the 20-minute daf, 20minutedaf.com, and you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.